Well, good morning and or good afternoon or good evening, as the case might be. Welcome or welcome back if you're returning to this series of live webcasts that we at Deloitte have been delivering over the last, 3.5 years now. My name is Dalibor Petrovic. I'm a partner at Deloitte, and I have a pleasure of leading our tech executive and leadership programs. I've been a host of these webcasts, and we have designed this series for multiple purposes. First, to showcase Canadian technology leaders so that Canadian technology leadership audiences can hear from most senior technologists in Canada on how they are thinking about their jobs, what are their career stories, where they're heading, what are the challenges they're dealing with and strategies they're deploying to succeed. But then we're also using the channel to showcase what we think are relevant, timely topics important for all technology leaders to think about and understand. And today, we have one of those conversations prepared for you. We're going to talk about a very, very critical, important topic of IT workforce strategies. We're going to explore what are we seeing in the marketplace are the concerns and issues specifically related to IT and tech talent, their skills, and we're going to share with you some perspectives of what we see successful organizations do to deal with this very, very important critical issue. To unpack this, I'm joined by two of my colleagues and friends. Pauline Heurtevent is our technology strategist who actually leads Deloitte's IT operating model storefront and works a lot on this exact topic of IT talent, how to organize, mobilize, source IT talent, and then deploy them most effectively. And I'm also joined by Stepgen Harrington, who is a managing partner of our Future of Work practice at Deloitte. So thank you very much, Pauline. Thank you very much, Stepgen, for finding the time to be with us this morning. Now, Pauline, we're going to start with you, and we're going to start at the big picture view. I know that recently we have surveyed over 100 CEOs to ask them about their perspectives on, how do they view technology? Where do they view the importance of tech portfolio within their organizations? But we've also connected with CIOs to solicit their feedback. And that would be, I think, probably good place to start is to share what are the observations and get you to sort of comment on what you've seen.
For sure. And I think we do regular interviews of CEOs, and what's very interesting, it's we still haven't seen a major shift in the feedback that we're getting. So, for example, the first thing that we hear is we don't really see the true value of what technology is bringing to our business. Why? Because technology is still seen as a large service provider. So we ask you to run IT, keep the lights on, making sure our phones, our computers, everything is connected. But we don't see IT or technology yet as a big disruptor or an influencer of the business strategy. And so that's showing in very different ways because, IT is reporting on a very project by project basis. So again, hard to see the big picture impact they're bringing to the table. Even the reporting that they're doing is still very operational versus business value oriented. So it's creating a series of ripple effects where technology is not always how to see at the table. And what we are seeing and hearing loud and clear is that everything that's happened in the last few years is creating a very, very critical need for technology to be at the table and help, build the business strategy.
So what I'm almost hearing you say is that expectations of the business at the moment, which was captured in that sort of what is priority number one, is to align tech investment with business strategy. Expectation is there, but the performance ain't there yet.
And there's a true reason for that. It's because typically the role that you hire for a CIO is someone who's very good technologically speaking, someone who understands the hardware behind it and can make very good tech decisions. But the shift we're seeing is to be able to get that seat at the table and really showcase the value technology can bring to the business is getting more of a business CIO, which is, in itself a little bit weird to say, but you need a skill set that is very different from one to the other. And so the shift we're seeing, and a lot of organizations are doing it very successfully, is starting to have a CIO that is very oriented towards working with the business and being that storyteller to the business. And then to help them, they have a CTO, so Chief Technology Officer, who can then support the running of IT, which is a lot more operational.
Yeah. So it almost feels like the traditional role of IT that has always been there to support and enable technology in the business continues. And then there is an emergence layer on the top that actually has not been very present in the past. And the business is really saying, hey, we need this. We assume this is in place, but we really expect you to operate at this level. And to operate at this level, you have to have business credibility, executive presence, storytelling, emotional intelligence, as well as intelligent intelligence, right? So, and that, I understand what you're saying is that here is now a gap, but it is also a massive opportunity.
Yeah, and I would add, Dalibor, that the gap isn't just for CIOs and IT. To be fair, the business and the enterprise have to start thinking about technology differently as well. I think we're just still coming out of a long time frame where we thought of technology as something that you go and buy. Here is the technology I want, the business might say, which frustrates IT for obvious reasons.
Oh, yeah.
We're at a really interesting crux between build and buy strategies in IT shops, because there's a lot more build opportunity than there used to be. And in a way, that's a much more complex strategy business to run, because it opens up the aperture of all kinds of ways technology could be deployed, versus just, here are the few vendors we're going to work with.
Yeah. And so this is excellent. So there is a gap, an opportunity at the leadership level of IT, which is linked to talent, but then there is also a gap in the teams themselves that we are going to be unpacking. So this is like it's a two-pronged opportunity / challenge that organizations are facing in the system. Stephen, maybe the good moment, and by the way, I wanted to make sure that audience knows this is actually happening live. So you have an opportunity to submit a question or a comment using a Q&A feature of the Zoom platform if you'd like to. So please, I encourage you to submit questions to us. We'll address them as we go. So Stephen, let's take a step back or two and maybe look at the overall employment markets and this shifting landscape that we are living through.
Absolutely, Dalibor. So they're kind of, if I simplify things, 10 years of studying future work into three things in 2023 post-pandemic, I think we can focus on the fact that markets are disrupted. I mean, this may seem obvious, but if you look on the left there as to what's on the mind of CEOs, they're worried about inflation, geopolitical instability, supply chain disruption. But notice that number 3 on the concern list is now labor and skill shortages. And we'll get deeper into that in a minute. But for IT, this shifting business model challenge means that there's this need to suddenly, for many IT organizations, make new investments in technology capabilities that weren't on the table only a few years ago. So for an example, investments in supply chain, ESG. So that's hitting IT departments while they're going through that big shift that Pauline was talking about a moment ago.
Yeah.
The second thing that's happening at the same time, which deepens the challenge, is that the employment market has really changed its mind about work. I often try to get people to imagine or remember what it was like to work from home for so many Canadians during the pandemic in IT. A lot of people in IT do very independent work, especially early in their career.
Yeah.
So what we essentially did is we ripped them out of the everyday social and cultural connection to their business. And remember, we told them it'll only be 2 weeks. 2 weeks became 2 years. And my question for leaders is often, if you were stuck doing data transformation, for an example, on the corner of your kitchen table for 2 years by yourself, how long would it take before you asked yourself, wait a minute, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
So there's been sort of an existential crisis and a reframing of how people feel about work. One of the shorthands I often use for this is a bit of a generational shorthand. If you came into the market as a baby boomer or a Gen Xer like me, greatest generation ever, you most likely thought, I'm lucky to have a job. And our whole employment market was calibrated to the you're lucky to have a job mindset. But what's changed and was accelerated by the pandemic is that millennials and Gen Zs are far more likely to think you're lucky to have me. And that describes a lot in what I think IT leaders are struggling with, and why we're seeing things like the average tenure in the US drop to under 3 years, meaning people are switching jobs at an incredible pace, seeking these preferences. I probably don't need to highlight that one of those preferences is flexibility. That's the biggest challenge I'm seeing both public and private sector organizations struggle with, is huge demand for flexibility that doesn't always meet business reality.
Yeah.
And then the third and the final big shift, like the headline is obvious, the technology landscape is relentless. But what I want to point out about that is that it is forcing skills change at a much faster rate than IT departments are used to, even in the last decade or two. And what that means is the job itself has become a little bit unstable. You probably could have, reached out for a enterprise architect 10 years ago and been relatively certain of what you would get in returning that container of the job. But now, because so many organizations are taking on new skill sets, new technologies, it's very likely that when you buy somebody from the market, they're going to be missing skills that you uniquely need. This isn't just a challenge about finding the right skills in the employment market. It's about keeping your whole retained workforce up to speed, so their capability and capacity isn't dropping as these new technologies and approaches come online.
And I think, to your point, Stephen, if I may add to it, is skills is no longer transactional. It's no longer I need a skill and therefore I hire. What you just described is also creating an opportunity to be able to think about your talent differently and say, do I have people within my technology team who have interest in different things? So when you think about architecture, do I have people who have an interest in that? Do I have people who are, good storytellers and could potentially support us? And then can I just put in the training and reskilling them instead of hiring?
Yeah, I think the big challenge for Canadian organizations is to figure out how to be different in the employment market. So how can you stand out against other IT departments, not by paying more, not by having the perfect brand or the perfect work location, but by saying, actually, the deal when you come to work for us is fundamentally different and attractive in ways that are going to help you stand out. I know that sounds like strategy 101, but we have this tendency when it comes to HR and the way we organize something like IT to actually work very hard at being exactly the same as our competitors. Same job descriptions, same structures, same working hours, et cetera, and that's just not going to work in a Canada at under 6% unemployment.
Yeah. What is interesting, of course, issue number one for CEOs, as we saw, is the inflation and interest rates. Issue number 3 is skills. We are in a soft economy, in a soft market with sort of high inflation, but low unemployment.
Yes.
And this, I'm sure, adds additional pressure to this whole conversation, right? But people are actually, workforce is working.
It's a great point, Dalibor. And there was a theory about a year or two ago that I kept hearing. Business leaders would say to me, yeah, I know employees are demanding a lot these days, but don't worry, there's a recession coming and the shoe will be on the other foot. We'll win back our bargaining power. Well, so far that hasn't happened. And one of the underlying reasons is that we're also in the middle of an absolutely mammoth retirement boom that we've known was coming for decades, with the baby boomers exiting the workforce faster than we can replace them. We are in this weird position of being, either in a recession, I'm not sure, or close enough, but with still a very tight labor market.
Tight labor markets, skill sets that are evolving. And then I remember I saw on your previous slide, 38% of Canadian workers said that they would quit if their organization demanded their full return back to work 5 days a week. And Stephen, is there a variant there between tech people who work in tech and people who don't, or is it consistent, or any sort of reflections on that?
I'm waiting for good data on it, Dalibor, but I can tell you through conversations with IT leaders, especially in the public sector, one of the things that we're worried about is that sort of middle layer of IT management and supervisory are finding themselves far more often than we'd like in a position where they are over-reporting how often their people are coming in order to be compliant to HR policies, because they're worried about losing their people.
Yeah,
that's not something that we'd like to see continue, obviously, where you basically have IT leaders feeling like they have to cover up the amount of flexibility that their department is seeking just to keep people.
Yeah.
I think it's a huge challenge.
Yeah. And of course, now we have these emerging technologies coming in. Focus on automation, artificial intelligence. So, Stephen, what do you think or know or assume that impact of these technologies is going to have specifically the IT skill sets needed for the future?
Okay, this is going to be my geekiest answer all day, Dalibor. So if
let's
it doesn't
hear it.
land, I preface that it might not. I like to talk about generative AI just to talk about something specific here. And one of the things that's amazing about generative AI, and not to overblow it, obviously there are challenges with these solutions, but one thing it is out of the box today is extremely fungible to multiple use cases. More than once, I've been sitting with leaders in our AI practice and going through use cases in a function like, case management. We put 3 use cases on the table, and the client says, wait a minute, I can think of 10 more. And what I think that means is we're at this period where we're shifting from the old question for IT used to be, here's a task that we don't like anymore, a process we don't like anymore. Can we automate it?
Yeah.
Now the answer far more often is yes, of course we can. So the question is shifting to, should we automate it? And I don't just mean from an ethical perspective. I mean, is it the right decision? Is it the right investment? Is it going to change the work in ways that will make it both more productive and more engaging for our workforce? So this is part of the long walk argument to say, I really think IT and HR need to start working a lot more closely together so we can get after this opportunity to augment human work with technology, as opposed to always thinking about how we can either replace the human or use the human to execute our strategies. It could be
and
both.
I know, of course, you and I have been discussing this for a while, that you are a proponent of the view that IT and HR perhaps even ought to be integrated into one.
That'd be the boldest move, wouldn't it?
And right, one unit. Because what you just described is actually very true. HR and IT coming together to really augment and automate work everywhere across the organization. Who is in better position than these two entities collaborating with the business, of course, to solve for that particular problem?
And
yeah, if I describe that at the business strategy level, Pauline, I'll just get this in quickly. I want to hear your thought, but at the business strategy level, the senior team sets where we're going to play and how we're going to win. And then they toss the question of how are we going to have the capability necessary to both HR and IT.
Yes.
To work separately on the question, which I think, to your point, Dalibor, is increasingly not making sense. The question is, how are we going to have the capability? And it's going to be a mix of humans and technology. How do we bring that thinking together? Sorry, Pauline, you were going to say.
Oh, no worries. I had 2 thoughts I wanted to share. The first one on, automation. The reality is technology today is not mature enough in terms of data and other types of components that are needed to automate. So we still have a little bit of leeway to be able to get the data right before we can actually start automation. And it's giving the chance for that proximity to get better between technology and HR. So that was the first point. And then the second point, very tied to what you just say, Stephen, but what we're seeing now a lot more in operating model work is that necessity to have a talent hub capability embedded in the technology. And their sole focus is one, thinking about those skill set and career path for people, because you have new roles emerging every day, whether it's through the new technology that are coming up or just through the evolution of the technology model and the business needs. But then you also have the view of working closer with the HR to be able to speed some things up and be able to help technology and their, hiring, automation, and et cetera processes. So that's becoming a bigger reality now, that talent hub, and organizations are starting to implement it and test it.
Yeah. So thank you for that. I absolutely. I think these are all reactions to a skill set crisis, access to talent crisis, growth of the talent crisis. And if we let's go there next. If we can zoom maybe into that specific IT landscape of IT skill sets, Stephen, I know that you have a point of view that the IT domain actually is going through a skills crisis. So I'd love to hear your sort of reflections, thoughts on that.
Yeah, you can see by the numbers on the left that I think there's demonstrably a crisis of skill in IT. The other thing we're hearing anecdotally is vacancy rates are going up in many IT departments. So they're filling more and more roles with contractors to try and bridge the gap. And there are some real challenges associated to that as well. I mean, there'd be less if we were better and better at borrowing to build, as we say in the workforce strategy space, meaning borrowing contractors not only to get work done in IT, but also to transfer skills to the retained workforce. But that's often just the dream, and it never quite happens because we can't catch up with capacity. But I also thought I'd point out, Dalibor, one of the metaphors that I've been using to understand the employee of today, whether they're already working for you or you're trying to attract them, is they're behaving a lot more like consumers than they ever have before when it comes to the job. And they're looking for a shopping cart of benefits that used to be easy to boil down to mostly pay, brand, and work location. Now, the number one question that recruiters are facing is flexibility. There are also more questions about whether or not I'm going to get an opportunity to reskill. And there are questions about workload that people are getting in IT before somebody's even started the job. Because this Generation Z in particular is very wary of burnout and mental health challenges in the workforce. So one of the ways to think about the big challenge we're facing is, how do we create employee value propositions that appeal to this much broader set of demands we're seeing from employees today, in order to have a chance to, as I said earlier, stand out in the market, but also to keep folks longer.
One point maybe that I can add to that, Stephen, is we touched on it a little bit about contractors. The reality is, maybe sometimes smaller companies, not everybody can afford to outsource or use offshore services. So that build, borrow, or buy concept is not always applicable. And some companies have no choice but to use contractors. And in addition to that knowledge management, challenge that you were raising, I think there's also two other risks that are coming from the use of contractors, which is one, how do you keep your company culture? And you were talking about it, Stephen, like work-life balance, flexibility. These are number one criteria that employees are looking for today. So what happens when you have a massive, injection of contractors coming into your team, and they're all working from home, but then the expectation is full-time employees have to work from the office. And it's creating an imbalance that sometimes, creates reactions from the employee side. And then the third point around contractors was succession planning. When we look about upskilling, and then you're also thinking about building your leaders of tomorrow for technology, it's always easier to build a leader that's already in-house versus hiring a successor. So using contractors is limiting your window of potential successors for some of the leadership roles. But I know there are some mitigation in place to be able to counter that. But it is some of the challenges we're seeing.
Yeah, 100%. And often employers in IT will say, I can't find anything but contractors in this skill set, so they feel they have no other choice. But to your point, Pauline, in a perfect world, if there's a skill set that's core to your strategy in IT, you're either buying it, so hiring, or you're building it because you want to maintain it. And where maybe it's less core, maybe that's where you can use more contractors or outsourcing options. That's classically the way to do it. But since it's not working very well, the other thing we're getting CIOs to think about is, how do you get to know your contractors better? There's this tendency for us to sort of pay 100% of our attention to those that are in our workforce that we employ, and really just manage the contract for everybody else. But they're humans too, and they have wants and desires and skills that maybe we don't know about. So if we can get to know our contractors better and make sure they fall in love with us, well, first of all, it'll be easier to contract them because they'll want to work for us more than anyone else.
Yep.
And maybe we can convert some of those contractors if we set up the right sort of environment. So I know it's tough because HR can't help with that contractor talent view, but maybe we can start to widen the aperture of what the talent ecosystem actually looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We are going to come back, Stephen, to some strategies that you see organizations do or think of and deploy to solve for this skill sets challenge. Of course, we already know contracting is one. But before we get there, I wanted to ask Pauline, of course, Pauline runs our IT operating model practice. I'd be curious to know, Pauline, how have you observed sort of the evolution or the emergence of operating models that intend to provide value while addressing these kind of issues? And I would also love to know your thoughts about where do you think the operating model is kind of heading? Like where is this actually going? So can you give us maybe a little bit of a one-on-one on operating models and what you're seeing in real world?
Okay. So first thing is probably something I'm not supposed to say, but when you look at operating model, the reality is 80% of the capabilities are roughly the same as they were a few years ago. What's really changing is how you put those capabilities together and how the people are going to work on them.
Yes.
And I say 80% because you have innovation that's starting to pop up. You have AI, you have other emerging technologies that we already discussed. They're having an impact on the capabilities. But overall, you still had architecture in the past. You have architecture now. You have data, et cetera, et cetera. In the past, there was this really big mentality in technology, and maybe Stephen will teach me a little bit more about the rest of the enterprise. But in technology, that command and control mentality was very present. And it was add to that layer of the bigger my sandbox, the biggest the influence I have. So leaders were almost doing their best to have the most resources under them. That was a sign that you were moving up, and it was a recognition of your leadership skills and your talent and the results you were bringing. That command and control is something that we're completely trying to tear apart now, because we've seen that that's not how tech needs to evolve, and that is not how tech will become a partner to the business. So it's about having the most impact and value to the business versus having the most people working under you. And so what it concretely means in terms of operating model is you're moving from a very centralized way of working, where one team, one function is sitting together under one leader, versus now everything is more federated. So you're going to have a hub sitting somewhere, but then you would have agents in different teams to make sure that whatever you're implementing in that function is really shared across the business. So, you can think about it around different ways, but if I take the enterprise architecture function, you're going to have architects sitting with the business to make sure that we understand you correctly. We're sharing the right messages. We're actively influencing you, even though the mother home is in technology. And it's creating a critical need for leaders to be very comfortable with dotted lines. to be comfortable with having a couple of resources in their team because everybody else is sent across the organization. So it's requiring a completely different skill set from leaders and even from employees, because you have to be comfortable having 2, 3, 4 dotted lines.
Absolutely. Wow. So this is actually very good. So what you're saying is historically IT command and control. What we're seeing now is that that model is being broken into, let's meet our clients where they are.
Exactly.
Let's meet the clients where they are. And then what you're seeing is emergence of these units that are embedded. As a matter of fact, we had a word for that. It was called shadow IT in the past, and people were trying to kill this, right?
Sure.
I think what's happening now is leaders are realizing, no, that's how it should be. This is where the value is actually created, while we still have to have. Now, I wanted to ask you, Pauline, about obviously central functions have value. Clearly, right? Any sort of comments on how should organizations think about what should be that central capabilities and skill sets required there versus those that are federated, delivered more localized, right?
Yeah, so you need to still have some centralized functions that are, if you think about shared services, you want to make sure that the way that the model is set up, the governance, the KPIs, everything is set up the same way across business functions. So you still need to have that centralized hub to be able to provide those guidelines, because what you don't want to do if we take a more concrete example, like project management, so portfolio management, you don't want to have agents in different parts of the business who do their own recording, their own, intake form, who only bring up certain projects for value for the business. So you want to ensure that you have the same processes across the different agents and the same governance model. So that is really key. One way that firms are starting to do this is through community of practices or centers of excellence. So I won't go necessarily into all the specifics of the models, but community of practices is really ensuring you put people together with those same interests and be able to then leverage knowledge and bring it back to your mother team, for lack of a better word. The Center of Excellence is a lot more formalized. So once you decide to participate, it is becoming mandatory, and then the reporting and the governance lines are shared across the different members of the Center of Excellence. So 2 different approaches, but both of them have one component that is the same, which is you have people from different teams coming together.
And you can see how those structures that Pauline just talked about tie back to what we started with, which is that demand to be more business focused, the structures following that strategy. But the other thing that's happening is there's more places for an individual employee to sit within that structure. In other words, they're more flexible and fungible across different business demands as a result. And by the way, that helps with the employee experience and change of preference I talked about. Because
absolutely,
employees we can't always give it to them, but they want variety of experience. They want to build new skills. And in IT in particular, they want cool work. They want to work on things that matter or the newest technologies. And with those older command and control structures that Pauline talked about, people get stuck in place, and it gets a lot harder to move people around, both for business value, but also for that employee experience.
This is all screaming the word flexibility. It's all screaming flexibility, flexibility, flexibility. As a matter of fact, one of our tech trends we discussed this year is called flexibility is the best ability. As in, organizations clearly are moving to create these flexible experiences. But interesting thing is that also requires people who are comfortable in an ever-changing work environment. They need to also be embracing flexibility. Now, I think that flexibility that we spoke earlier about, can I have a flexible work arrangement so I don't have to go to the office every day? It's a different kind of flexibility mindset. From the flexibility of, I embrace change all the time, right? That's hard to find.
I was going to say, Dalibor, flexibility, the way that people are using the word right now is mostly around working arrangements. Can I work from
Yes.
home? Can I work abroad? Which is also a big question that we're seeing. My company's in Canada. Can I just go spend 5 weeks in Portugal and work from there since I'm working from home? But the flexibility that we need to see happen is also in terms of career path. And that is very new and very,
Yes.
it's harder to put in place. It's very demanding for leaders. And it's also an abrupt change, even for the employees. They're asking for it, but it's a little scary to see it in motion, because you have to have a lot of faith in your new system. Typically, employees, when you go into a function, your next step and your promotion is not going to happen when you're ready and you're capable. It's going to happen when your boss or another higher up role than you either gets promoted, retires, or
Leaves.
firm.
Yeah.
So you have very limited option. And when that happens, there's probably 20 of you aiming for that position. So flexibility in the career path is becoming really critical to keep people engaged. But that means rethinking the skills, rethinking how you train people, because you no longer train them for their one function.
Yeah, we're on board in the HR world. We're saying exactly the same thing. It's moving from flex work to flex everything.
Flex everything.
But while the hybrid question's on the table, I will say even in that space, we need to redefine flexibility to not just be the where of work, but also the when and the how. Right. And
yes.
And if I think if a lot of IT organizations realized they had more options for how they could meet the flexibility demand, it would take some pressure off this I want to be working from home 5 days a week challenge. Because the when and the how opportunities for flexibility are just as exciting if you can figure out how to roll them out at scale.
Very, very cool. Very good. So what I would love to do, I think that we've established the problem statement here. Skill sets are changing. Environment is changing. There is a deficiency in skill sets. Flexibility is the word of the decade, probably. I would love to ask you, Stephen, what advice do you have for organizations that are grappling with this? What have you seen are some successful strategies and tactics that organizations deploy to address this particular IT skill set issues?
Yeah, one of my favorites right now is it's a little on the bold side, but I think it's worth a conversation. So when we ask people to reskill in Canada, we actually tend to send them back to college and university, which is a funny thing to do because we know when somebody goes for a 3 or 4 year degree, they're going to learn 100% of a domain. And when they turn around and ask the labor market for a job, they're probably going to use 5 to 10% of what they just learned in that first job. So the question the rapid reskilling trend is asking is, why can't we just teach people the 5 or 10% they need for that job and leave the rest for later? There's a great program that started out of Australia that was retraining ex-military members who maybe in some cases didn't even have IT backgrounds, but they had already had a higher education experience and been professional soldiers. And they were reskilling them in cyber to work in the security operations center, entry-level jobs. And they did it through an 8-week boot camp. So just 8 weeks. But all that 8 weeks was about, they'd warn you ahead of time, I'm not going to teach you everything about cyber. I'm only going to teach you about your job and what your first week in the SOC is going to be like. And then they had employers lined up to take the people out of the boot camps right into SOCs and kept connected that team through a digital platform that would allow themselves to ask each other questions during the day if they got stuck. So a bit of a peer group. And there would be an expert cyber coach on that same platform in case they all get stuck. That was it in terms of learning for the next year of their experience on the job. So truly a rapid reskilling plan with an apprenticeship model to try and get people more quickly into higher skilled jobs. And by the way, I think it's a powerful idea, not just because we have such gaps in IT today, but also because it's an incredible diversity, equity, and inclusion play. Because you can now engage, women in technology more quickly, indigenous groups, retired military members, a lot of people that maybe don't see a path into IT today can suddenly see a path because it's faster.
I love it. This is absolutely fantastic. Now, you mentioned this was a pilot that was done in Australia. Do you know sort of what are the results of this? And is there a Canadian organization, like who in Canada ought to be doing this? Is it everybody? Is it on like, how would you see this translate?
Yeah, so Deloitte Australia has done some work in this space. There's an organization out there called With You, With Me that does the military organization approach that I mentioned, and they do operate here in Canada. A lot of the sourcing associations out there who help different communities find tech jobs are starting to play with this idea. So I think the experiment is running. What we need to see now is more and more organizations, public and private sector, demand these services and be willing to take the big leap of taking a chance on talent that came through non-traditionally. Actually, Dalibor, the other thing is just colleges have been churning out micro-credentials at an incredible pace. And not a lot of employers recognize those micro-credentials yet. So I think there's lots of ways to get involved if you're interested in that idea as an employer.
Yeah. And as a matter of fact, what you described can be scaled down to the level of the organization itself, right?
Yeah, I think if you were a small, medium enterprise and you had 10 people in your IT org, you could run your own boot camp. As long as you have one person in your shop, contractor or not, who already has the skill set you need, it's just a time commitment. It's good old-fashioned apprenticeship with a 21st century spin.
Pauline, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was gonna complement that so we've talked about skilling. I would talk even about the job descriptions when you hire. And right now the job descriptions, Stephen mentioned it a little bit, they're very generic, and from one company to the next, the job skills will be the same. What we're seeing now is a lot more focus on soft skills versus hard skills. Again, because technology is moving so quickly that what you want is to ensure you have people who have curiosity, who have leadership skills, storytelling skills. And the effect of companies who are doing that is also increasing the diversity and equity criteria, because the reality is most women, and there are so many other categories of people, when they apply to a job, they wait to have 100% of the check marks on each of the boxes in the list. When you start focusing more on the soft skills, you're helping yourself in the process of emerging technologies and just moving IT forward. But you're also helping people who have the soft skills but don't necessarily have the degree to go or the experience with every one of the hard skills presented. So it's also creating a shift, and we're seeing really dramatic results in companies that are doing that.
Yeah, but I love that, Pauline, because I used to do this exercise with senior execs where I'd get them to read their own company's job descriptions and ask themselves, would you apply to that job? Do you feel qualified? And you always end up with a horrified look when people are reading these things, because they've been composed to keep people away. Yeah. There was one employer I worked with that tried this amazing experiment where their help wanted ads changed to, this is our mission. These are the team members you'd be working with. And they got those folks on the team to agree to have little mini profiles in the help wanted ad of who they were as people. And then almost in small print at the bottom, it was like, oh, by the way, the job is this, and we'd like skill sets like that. But what they put out front was, fall in love with us and join us first, and then let us talk to you about
I love this.
what skills we need you to have.
I love this. One more. So we just shared a couple of strategies that are really, I think, new, innovative. I'd like to add one, the story that I know from our tech trends research. It actually is with Mercedes-Benz. And what they've done is they've actually facing similar challenge. How do you find the right deep specialist? We don't really want a generalist. We need a deep specialist, but it takes so long to find a deep specialist. It's expensive, long. By the time we hire them, their skill sets might already need to be updated. It's kind of a losing fight. It's a net zero-sum game. So what they were contemplating and what they did is they introduced the concept of a serial specialist, which is not so. It actually, I think, expands a little bit on this story of upskilling the military to join the organization, is what they are committing to do is to actually invest in the development of their people, to build them as specialists, but for a limited time of a number of years. And then the agreement is that there'll be continuous investment in you to reskill you to become a serial specialist on a domain that we will need in 4 years, and then in 8, and then in 12. So the people that they hire, they don't hire them because they know coding or Python. They hire them for curiosity, attitude, aptitude. And that is kind of the third way that we see emerging. And we already see examples. I mentioned Mercedes-Benz is an example that is documented in our tech trends. But this, I think, is yet another strategy that organizations need to seriously consider.
Yeah, and you raise a great point, Dalibor. There's a lot more capability out there at low cost to measure the psychology of the people that you're thinking about hiring, to understand whether they've got the right aptitudes, empathy, drive, etc. Great Canadian company out of Waterloo called Plum, by the way, who does this at scale. Check them out if you're interested in what Dalibor was just talking about.
Fantastic. We have a number of questions coming in. I'd like to ask a couple of our audience questions. Flexibility, Flexibility. What will the work week look like in coming years? Do you have any sort of thoughts and reflections on that sort of expectation? We know that in Scandinavian countries, there are successful experiments of shifting to a shorter work week. Any sort of reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean, this has been one of the major topics in the future of workspace going back well over a decade. And the debate is hot and probably not satisfied. Because, you know, if you look back to the 1950s and 1960s, the sort of the beginning of tech optimism, the idea back then was we're going to get new technologies and work less and less. There were people in the 60s predicting that by the 80s, people would be working 3 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
Now, unfortunately, so far, the truth is we've seen the more technologies that come into the market, actually, it seems the more we work. So far, the trend of productivity has not been what we expected, and there's lots of complex reasons for that. But I am of the mind, if we were to have this debate, Dalibor, that we are going to hit a sort of critical pivot point. Mm-hmm. And generative AI might be the beginning of that, where the application of technology across the tasks that we do becomes so pervasive that we begin to run into areas where we wonder, can we keep people busy full-time anymore? Is this even how work is going to operate? Yeah. The mindset shift that I think we can all think about to get ready for that moment is to shift from an inputs and outputs view of performance in IT to an outcomes-based.
I love it.
Because, you know, basically the reason I argue this is it's good for us now. It's like eating a healthy meal instead of snacking on sugar, right? We might as well do it, because when you get people focused on outcomes, they are focused on time and quality and cost, because that's what outcomes are. Yeah. If we focus people on inputs and outputs, we've created an artificial cap on what's possible.
Yeah.
But the other nice thing about moving to outcomes is that we will probably find that at some point, we'll notice people are working less and less and achieving the outcomes anyway. And the real challenge for organizations can we have the mindset shift to allow that to happen and be okay with it?
Yeah. Exactly, because when you start measuring for outcome, suddenly the activities don't really matter that much. Doesn't matter. Work. If you want to work all night and sleep all day, all power to you, as long as you are healthy and balanced and happy, and the outcome is generated. Yeah. So another related question: many organizations actually measure their revenue models are based on input. Like Deloitte, for example, historically, we've been in business 178, approaching 180 years. Wow. Time and material, selling hours. How is this going to impact organizations who actually operate by selling, those widgets we call hours, for example?
Yeah, I think, and Dalibor and Pauline, you've been part of this conversation, I'm sure, at Deloitte for the last few years. We really want to move towards value-based business because it just makes more sense to be able to say to a client, this is the value we'll deliver. What is the reasonable price of that value? And then the motivation for the organization becomes to deliver more value faster, which I think is in the interest of our clients. And it's a great question, Dalibor, because I feel like IT is a lot like a professional services organization.
It is.
They find themselves in the same
It
boat.
is. Yes.
And how could IT organizations get themselves out of the selling of time and into offering their customers value? I think that's a really good mindset shift.
That's actually a very good parallel. Yes, Pauline.
Yeah, I think the challenge we have with IT is the consumers of technology are also becoming a lot more demanding now. So when we have and I'm losing my words in English, but a breakdown, for lack of a better word, we're expecting technology or IT tech to be able to solve it immediately. We don't care if it's happening at 2 a.m. because, like you said, you now have people who are using their flexibility to be able to work whenever they want. So if I decide to work at night, because that's how I get my best work-life balance, and I can't access anything on my phone or my computer at 2 a.m., I expect technology to be able to resolve it pretty fast. And the higher you are, the faster you want it resolved. So while we do want to see a control shift of being, bringing that flexibility to people and being more value-based, there will still be a baseline running IT that needs to be almost a follow the sun model where you want people to be on 24 hours 7. And the way to do that by preserving people's sanity is to be using offshore models and then, not imposing those timelines on one team.
Yeah.
It reminds me, Pauline, it's because there's a wisdom in what you're saying about segmenting your workforce and thinking about what kinds of big strategies and policies will work for different segments, so that outcomes value-based view might not work as well for ops. But it reminds me, one of the clients I've been working with was looking at the 4-day work week for a long time and asking themselves whether they could do it for all of administration. And the answer was no, it was just too complicated. They couldn't get there. But then they had what was a seemingly simple but bold idea. Maybe they offer a 4-day work week only to some job segments where it makes sense. And now they're exploring that. I wish them luck, and I'm going to be following them closely because in Canada in particular, we have this obsession with fairness, which is a good obsession, but we're heading into a market where, as I've said earlier, preferences are becoming more diverse. So it's becoming less and less possible to give everybody the same deal and have them be satisfied and happy, nor to give the business the same service in every context and have them be satisfied or happy. Yeah. So we're probably going to end up with different deals for different people in different roles and have to somehow contain that.
As a matter of fact, I think that this is actually what's happening in a society and in other areas as well. Like technology is allowing for mass personalization of your experiences in everything. So if we are saying flexibility is the best ability, that logically leads to the fact that there probably needs to be some form of mass personalization of that work experience.
Yeah, there was a design principle, Dalibor, that we discovered when we were doing hybrid strategies. We called it something for everyone. And it was a principle that said that every employee, whether they have to come to the site or not, should have some sort of new deal post-pandemic. But it went back to that flexibility definition I talked about earlier, not just of where, but also of when and how.
Yeah.
So maybe in this future IT organization we're talking about, everybody has a different deal, but it's uniquely theirs, and it is a new deal, and it has one of those types of flexibilities in it to make it attractive.
No, you see, that would make an organization that posts that as their value proposition an attractive place for people to work at, right? That's also a link back to a comment you made. How do you differentiate yourself amongst thousands of IT departments that all perform 80% similar things? This would be part of that key. Sebastian here mentions the book called The Real Business of IT, How CIOs Create and Communicate Value. So I just want to shout out to Sebastian. Thank you for sharing. But there's another question that Adrian here posts. He says, we have high number of retirees, as you mentioned, baby boomers, who actually still are young, energetic, want to contribute. So there's this kind of concept of soft retirement. So where I want to go with this is Stephen, we mentioned one source of talent is let's upskill those who are not in IT, give them sufficient insight quickly so they can start working. Then there is a senior specialist. Then we have contractors. What other pools of skills do you think or know are in the ecosystem that IT leaders ought to think of, contemplate, mix and match to supplement what they need?
Yeah, and we're seeing lots of our clients do this, but it would be nice to see even more bring back people maybe who've already retired or considered retiring in a contract or a flexibility that works for them. So maybe they only want to work 2 days a week, but they have an incredible knowledge set that you're not ready yet to replace. The big challenge becomes, can you accommodate that? I think that's one of the big challenges in HR at the intersection of IT is how much can we accommodate and how will we manage it all? The other one I think about, though, which was popular for a while in the last decade, but seems to have gone a bit by the wayside, is the opportunities to crowdsource solutions in IT. I mean, often, I still love the NASA story where they had the heat shield that broke on them. And rather than try and fix it themselves, which would have taken years, they did a crowdsourcing campaign with a prize for the team that could best fix this heat shield and fold it properly so it could go into the drone. And the winning team of that contest was led by an origami expert, an expert in folding. So what I love about that story is that if NASA had tried to solve the problem themselves, they never would have thought that they needed that origami expert. And they managed to create a workforce of thousands of people by simply being transparent and making their problem public and encouraging people to take part in it.
Yeah. Very cool. And of course, in addition, so we've got that pool of workers who would be engaged that way, recently retired and people who might be keen. There is a whole gig economy outside that is different from having contractors. Then there are contractors. And then there are ecosystem partners who can be engaged in some form of symbiotic relationships that are focused on shared value, shared risk, in addition to your own employees. So I think that I would like to leave us with the notion that actually the world here could be your IT department.
That's an awfully big ecosystem. And those that are going to the gig economy are going at a faster and faster pace. And ultimately, some of those people are saying, I don't want your damn full-time job. I found another way to engage with the workforce.
So I'll bring this back to Pauline, the role of a CIO, emerging role of a CIO, what you're seeing. It almost feels like plus one more skill, which is orchestration of the ecosystem that spans beyond people you pay bi-weekly as employees. Any sort of reflection on that?
There's the orchestration that's definitely new. You need to lead by example. So if you want your leaders on the ground to be able to manage a workforce that is becoming more and more diverse, more and more dotted line, more and more looking into reskilling and being owners of their career path, then you need to have a CIO who has that same mentality and understands the benefit and is willing to take some risks to be able to help move the needle forward. So that is becoming critical. And then again, leading by example, by being that true business ambassador, being at the table, and to be at the table, you need to show the value you bring first. So on this front, we're seeing the need for CIOs to first show they deliver, and then they can ask for the seat at the table and make changes. So that's more and more, but again, going back to the soft skills.
Yeah. Pauline and Stephen, we are at time. This was really a terrific conversation. Thank you very much. Thank you for the audience who joined us. Many questions. We were not able to address them all, so thank you for those. Next week, same time, Wednesday, noon Eastern, I will be joined by Chris Allison, who is the Vice President and a Country Manager for ServiceNow. And we're going to have a discussion on the CIO's perspectives on these large global platforms. How should they think about a platform? What are the issues? What are the opportunities? What are the strategies? Where is a platform heading? So please join me next week. If you're looking for the registration link, it'll be on the LinkedIn profile. And with that, I would like to thank you very much, Pauline and Stephen, for your time and for your experience and wisdom. And I'd like to wish you all a very, very happy Wednesday. Audience, thank you very much. See you next week. All the best.
Thank you for having us.